A long time ago, the ancient Egyptians said that death is nothing more than a gateway to a new world. They believed that after death, a person would return to life, but in a completely different form. Our story starts in England, 1127 AD. We see a group of soldiers who are guarding a precious gem. They place it in the tomb of an important figure, then seal the tomb shut. Cut to the present day, where an incredible discovery has been made: an ancient tomb that houses a group of Crusader knights. This tomb contains enormous treasures, some of which belong to the Egyptian civilization, as well as historic burial sites. The most significant discovery? The tomb of Princess Achaemet. Achaemet was an incredibly beautiful pharaoh's princess, but don't let her beauty fool you. She was also a fierce and ruthless warrior. Achaemet was the sole heir to the throne, but her father had other plans. He decided to surprise her by bringing home a younger brother from another woman, so that the throne would pass to him and all of Achaemen's hopes of ruling would be crushed. Achaemet wasn't the type to stay silent about this betrayal. She made a dark deal with the god of death, who granted her a dagger and supernatural power. With this dagger in hand, she set out to kill her father, his new wife, and their son. In exchange for the dagger, she was supposed to deliver the soul of a human for the god of death, to control and take on a human form. But just before she could finish her mission, the guards attacked. They killed the person she was about to sacrifice and captured her. As punishment, they mummified her while she was still alive, then sent her away from Egypt forever. Fast forward to the present day. Captain Nick is in Iraq, on a quest to find an ancient treasure buried deep underground. But the area they're in is crawling with rebels, and his friend Phil refuses to go with him, asking to be taken back to the city. Nick isn't having it, though. To force Phil to stay, he cuts the guy's water supply, knowing he has no choice but to follow. Nick is full of confidence, but as soon as they enter the village, the rebels attack. They're outnumbered and almost killed. But just in time, Phil calls in an airstrike to wipe out the rebels and give them a chance to escape. The planes strike the village, blowing it to pieces and killing a number of the rebels. The rest scatter and run for their lives. The impact from the bombs creates a massive hole in the ground, and right then the tomb they've been searching for is revealed. The rest of the forces now know the location of the tomb and head straight for the village. Nick lies to the general, telling him he was in the village because he heard they had hostages, and that he knows nothing about the tomb. But the general knows all about Nick's shady history with artifacts. He's aware that Nick has been tearing through Iraq to find the tomb, steal the treasures, and sell them on the black market. Before Nick can come up with a response, Dr. Jenny, the archaeologist, shows up and slaps him across the face for stealing the map of the tomb from her bag. The general orders them to descend into the tomb immediately to explore it. When they reach the bottom, they find a massive burial chamber filled with mercury. It leads them to another tomb inside, containing a pool of mercury surrounded by gigantic statues. Jenny quickly realizes that this isn't a tomb, this is a prison, and the person in the coffin is the one being kept locked away. Nick, eager to know what's inside the coffin, decides to take matters into his own hands. He uses force, shooting the ropes holding the coffin shut. Just as they're about to open the coffin, massive spiders appear, flooding the room and attacking them. But Nick isn't scared. These spiders aren't venomous, even though they're swarming all over Phil. Nick couldn't care less. He's too focused on the coffin, and as he starts to open it, he sees Princess Achaemet thanking him for freeing her. Nick is lost in a trance, caught up in his hallucinations of Achaemet, but Jenny snaps him out of it, telling him they need to notify the authorities about their discovery. They manage to pull the coffin out of the tomb and transport it via military jet. But during the flight, Phil starts showing strange symptoms from the spider bite. Nick, still lost in his thoughts, starts imagining himself as the one Achaemet would sacrifice to the god of death, to take his body for its vessel. When he snaps out of this vision, he sees Phil cutting the ropes on the coffin. Before anyone can stop him, the general tries to intervene, and Nick kills him instantly. Nick realizes something's off with Phil. It's like someone else is controlling him. So, he shoots him dead. As the gunfire messes with the plane's systems, the engine stalls and the plane flies straight into a flock of crows, crashing it entirely. Sadly, there's only one parachute left. Nick hands it to Jenny, deciding to sacrifice himself. Nick dies, but his body is sent to the morgue. After a while, Nick wakes up again, completely disoriented, especially when he notices there's not a single scratch on his body. Before he can move, he sees Phil next to him, looking like a zombie. Then, Phil vanishes as Jenny enters the morgue. Meanwhile, the police are investigating the crash site. They find the coffin, but it's open, and next to it lies the mummified body of Akhemet. When one of the officers gets too close, she grabs him, draining his soul to gain energy, enabling her to move. She then kills the second officer and drains his soul as well, turning them both into mummies she controls. Nick is sitting with Jenny in the bar, trying to make sense of everything that's happening to him. Jenny begins explaining about Princess Akhemet, telling him about the Death God's dagger and the red gem, which have the power to manifest the Death God in human form. She tells him that both the dagger and the gem had been hidden, but during the Crusades, the Knights stole them. The gem has been discovered, but the dagger is still missing. Out of nowhere, Phil reappears and tells Nick they need to leave immediately. Nick heads to the bathroom to talk to Phil without Jenny thinking he's lost his mind. Seriously? A guy who came back from the dead and you'd be surprised he's talking to a zombie? Anyway, Phil explains to Nick that they're cursed because of Akhemet. He says the proof is that Nick didn't die in the crash. He tries to convince Nick to follow Akhemet's orders to avoid more suffering. But Nick brushes him off and leaves the bathroom only to find himself in a strange place, surrounded by a moving mummy and an army of rats. Nick is terrified, but it turns out it's all just a hallucination. Jenny snaps him out of it. Nick starts telling Jenny everything that's been happening to him, and insists that if she doesn't believe him, she needs to follow him because he feels like he's meant to be somewhere specific right now. He takes her to an abandoned church, where Akhemet is hiding, waiting for him. Nick enters the church, feeling like someone's watching him, until he's ambushed by Akhemet's guards, who overpower him. Akhemet then appears, holding the dagger, and she's about to kill Nick to offer his soul to the Death God. But when she tries to use the dagger, she realizes it's incomplete and the gem is missing. So she delays the ritual for now. Jenny, who had been hiding, rushes into the church, but before she can escape, Akhemet attacks and grabs her. Nick fights back, takes down the guards, and stabs Akhemet with the dagger, then grabs Jenny and makes a run for it. As they drive away, Akhemet's guards chase them, forcing their car to flip over in the forest. Akhemet reappears, attacking Jenny to take the dagger, but someone shoots her with an arrow. We notice a heavily armed team in the forest who manage to capture Akhemet and take her into custody. Then, they drug Nick and take him with them. When Nick wakes up, he finds himself in a secret location filled with numerous ancient statues. The guards present him to Dr. Henry Jekyll, a neurologist who wants to examine him to figure out what makes him the perfect target for Akhemet. Akhemet is suffering from a mysterious illness and has to inject herself regularly with a strange treatment. Afterward, Nick is taken to Akhemet's prison, where he finds her bound to a system of tubes pumping mercury into her body to sustain her low energy. Nick approaches her and she speaks to him in ancient Egyptian, calling him the Chosen One and her assistant. To his surprise, Nick responds in the same language, telling her that he can never help her after she killed her father and son to take control of the throne. Meanwhile, the workers reach the red gem in the Crusader tomb, and this information reaches Akhemet, who is desperate to free herself by any means. She manages to control an insect to bite one of Dr. Henry's guards, allowing her to take control of him. Dr. Henry, however, has a plan to destroy Akhemet. He plans to collect the dagger and the gem, then kill Nick after the Death God takes control of him, eliminating them both for good. Akhemet controls the guard and orders him to lower the mercury level so she can regain her strength and free herself. Nick is distracted, trying to understand what exactly Dr. Henry wants from him. When Dr. Henry's treatment falls, Nick pushes it away, but then something strange happens. His body starts twitching, and he begins to change in a terrifying way. The alarms blare and the doors lock down. Dr. Henry attacks Nick, beating him, but Nick reaches the syringe and injects himself, reversing the transformation and returning to normal. Nick and Jenny try to escape the place, especially since Akhemet has freed herself and summoned the power of sand to destroy everything. This destruction doesn't just affect Dr. Henry's lab, but the whole city. Nick and Jenny end up fleeing through the sewers and into a subway tunnel. But with Akhemet's men spread out everywhere, they're relentlessly pursued beneath the city. They eventually find themselves trapped in an underground pool. Jenny can't swim and begins to drown. Nick is devastated, blaming himself for not being able to save her. Then, Akament arrives, holding both the dagger and the gem. She tells Nick that Jenny's fate was death and that they are destined for eternal life. But Nick doesn't give up. He attacks Akament, steals the dagger from her, and smashes the gem onto the ground, but it doesn't break. Akament warns him before he destroys the gem, telling him that if it's shattered, he will live a cursed life forever. At that moment, Nick decides to stab himself with the dagger, and the death god enters his body. We see two spirits fighting inside Nick's body, both struggling for control. In the end, Nick manages to overcome the death god and regain control over himself. Fueled by rage for the death of Jenny, Nick attacks Akament, defeats her, and finally takes her soul from her body forever. He then approaches Jenny, trying to bring her back. As he screams in her face, she revives. Jenny wakes up, searching for Nick, and finds him kneeling in the tomb. He tells her to stay away, unsure of what he has become. Just as Dr. Henry enters the scene, Nick disappears from the area. Dr. Henry explains to Jenny that Nick now carries two souls, one of good and one of evil, and in the end, he'll have to choose between them. Finally, we see Nick in the Moroccan desert with his friend Phil, who managed to bring him back from the dead using his newfound abilities. In the end, Nick chooses to live his life away from humanity. And I think this was the best decision he ever made in his life, after being part of the Mission Impossible movie series. And with that, we've reached the end of our film.